We need to go back and make sure that we're toggled on for both Facebook. So we should be going live here in just a minute. I've got both those toggled on. We'll give it a minute to decide, and I will let Zoe in. And now I'm going to lock the meeting.
And my sharing set, yeah, I can share.
In just a minute, give me 2 seconds. Yeah, you're set to share.
Okay,
So just
great.
let me do one thing here.
Yep,
Let
yep.
me make sure that, and it looks like we have gone live. Crystal, you're a co-host. Can Taryn or Crystal, do you see us going live now on Facebook?
I see it.
Awesome. Perfect, perfect, perfect. All right, the meeting is now locked. No one else can join this meeting. All right. Dr. Feldman, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, I'll start the introductions and they'll just hear me while we're looking at your screen.
Sure. All right, is everybody able to see that?
Yes.
And the captions, okay.
Perfect. Welcome, everybody, to the Center for Inclusive Excellence's first speaking event. The center itself, the Edwards Center, will launch officially in fall, but we've been building this initiative this semester with our fabulous CI research fellows, many of whom are with us here today to ask questions at the end, selected competitively across the Edwards College. They'll be posing questions, and the fellows, we just want to point out, have been actively involved in organizing every single aspect of this event. I'm also joined today by our phenomenal graduate student for the Center for Inclusive Excellence, Crystal Dotson, who's pursuing an MA in Communication Leadership. And she'll be introducing in a minute our CCU faculty discussion partners. Today's event will explore a powerful project of visual ethnography. Via this research and creative production, our collaborators developed the concept of improvisational waiting to describe the role of emergence, agency, and precarity that reflected the lived experiences of those sheltering at the Lux Hotel during the outbreak of COVID-19. Let's begin by welcoming our visiting speakers. Professor Lindsay Raisa Feldman, Feldman is an assistant professor of anthropology at University of Memphis, a visual ethnographer, and a public scholar. Her work sits at the intersection of identity and incarceration, and her research interests include cultural criminology, masculinity, identity, justice studies, intersectional race and gender studies, the anthropology of emotions, ethnography of prison, and critical social theory. Professor Michael Vincente Perez is an assistant professor of anthropology at University of Memphis as well, and works on refugees and the politics of ethno-national identity. Most recently, he is exploring meaning and practice of Islam among Muslims in Chile. Sounds fascinating. He also holds the human rights seat for the Members Programmatic Advisory and Advocacy Committee in the American Anthropological Association. Dr. K, would you mind introducing our faculty discussion partners today?
I do not, and just to welcome everyone again, we have Dr. Wendy Weinhold, who was actually one of my fantastic professors last semester. So we're so excited that she is joining us, and she will also be a faculty fellow that will be working with us next year. And we also have Professor Amanda Masterpaul, who works on theater of the oppressed and is a coordinator of the Lighthouse Project here in Horry County. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Crystal. And with that, because we have a short time and I think this discussion part of this is just going to be dynamite, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Okay, hi everyone. So happy to be with you all today, both on Facebook and YouTube, I think, as well here in the Zoom. We are presenting our article that was published in the Visual Anthropology Review just recently, titled Living at the Lux, Homelessness and Improvisational Waiting Under COVID-19. And like the introduction very nicely said, my name is Lindsay Raisa Feldman, and my colleague Michael Vincente Perez and I will be chatting today. So This here, as you see in the image, is Main Street in downtown Memphis, a normally bustling tourist area that intersects Beale Street, which is home of the blues and open container laws. What is most striking in this photo is absence, or rather the knowledge that everyone is somewhere else in this photo. This was taken in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we all stayed inside, isolated, uncertain about what would happen next. In this photo, what we see is waiting, a collective holding of breath. Although COVID-19 has been experienced differently for each person and for different groups of people along devastatingly stubborn racial and economic lines, the shared sentiment of waiting is what we took to analyze through the course of this ethnographic project. How do we wait in quarantine? What do we do while we wait? And who might we be or become in the wait?
In this presentation, we will explain how we conceptualized waiting among a group of women temporarily sheltered in the Lux Hotel during the summer of 2020. Thinking from the context of jazz, we developed a concept of waiting that we call improvisational. You'll hear more about this concept throughout the presentation, but I want to say now that the idea emerged from the fact that at the Lux, everyone was waiting. Waiting was a critical dimension of the experience of shelter, and it became the central focus of our research. Although most of us are probably used to thinking about waiting as a passive experience, like waiting for your turn at the doctor's office, our research at the Lux revealed something else. It brought us to the understanding that waiting was also an activity with profound implications. So while the women were waiting for things to happen at the Lux, waiting for food to arrive, waiting to hear about their future housing, and waiting for temperature checks, they were also actively constructing new temporalities and selves within the wait. In the present and towards the future, waiting at the Lux was, for some, a creative process of self-making and hope. The goal of this presentation, then, is to provide a brief view into the experience of waiting at the Lux and its significance for the women temporarily sheltered during the COVID-19 pandemic. We want to convey how, for some of the women, waiting provided an opportunity for reconstituting time and the self in preparation for a future.
So very briefly, this is the roadmap of the presentation for today, and then we'll jump into the discussion. First, we'll describe the origins of the project, then describe our methodology as well as positionality. Then we'll talk briefly about why visual anthropology, and then we'll dive into some ethnographic scenes of improvisational waiting, and then wrap up with some conclusions.
Our research at the Lux was an unexpected event. At the time, both Lindsay and I, like the rest of the country, were sheltered in place. With the semester over and the university closed, not much was happening. In my case, travel restrictions prevented me from returning to Chile for summer research. Lindsay similarly could not conduct her field work in the prison here in Memphis. Unable to do our research and confined to our houses, we were forced to adapt to the emerging conditions of life under COVID. One day during the spring, our chair sent an email to the faculty on behalf of a local organization that provides support to people experiencing homelessness. Given our department's applied approach and previous relationship with this organization, they invited our faculty to conduct research at their temporary shelter, the Lux Hotel in downtown Memphis. An ad hoc initiative developed in collaboration with the city, the organization wanted faculty to conduct interviews with the women sheltering at the Lux to better understand some of their backgrounds and experiences. Without any prior discussion about the research, both Lindsay and I responded to the request expressing interest. I should say that neither of us have experience working with people who are homeless in a research context. Yet the questions we sought to answer in this unexpected project were actually not that far removed from our research interests and experiences. Lindsay works with incarcerated people, and I work with displaced refugees. Although in different contexts, we both examine how individuals construct their lives within significant structural constraints and experience forms of forced waiting. Given the fundamental relationship between sheltering and waiting, we saw an opportunity to engage aspects of our research interests in a new context while supporting a local organization in its efforts to assist women experiencing homelessness.
I had to add some selfies in here to this presentation. So before we jump into the analytic portion of our project, we want to briefly discuss our methodology and relatedly our positionality in the field. Conducting an ethnography during COVID-19 was an intense and intimate experience. Intense in that it felt risky and to some degree taboo to be doing face-to-face research only a few weeks after masks had become the CDC recommendation, and while everyone was still at home. Intimate in the sense that this risk resulted in a sort of vulnerable exchange. Both our health and the health of the women we worked with were at the forefront of casual discussion of our methodology and in all of our interactions. In this way, the consent forms and IRB approvals took on an urgent and very real character and made Michael and I conscientious about our presence in the hotel, which we took as a call for continued self-reflexivity for us as ethnographers. Our positionality as academic researchers, people not facing homelessness and privileged in many intersecting dimensions, were brought into relief in conducting research in this particular space of precarity. And indeed, we argue all anthropologists should be attuned to this positionality, pandemic or not, when conducting fieldwork in spaces that are not our own. There were obvious challenges in conducting an ethnography during a pandemic. The space of the hotel turned shelter was close. You can see in a quick lighting test photo I snapped of Michael here, who had his back against the wall of a narrow hallway, that it was dark and the corridors were tight. This obviously impacted our ability to maintain social distance, a concept that was new at the time and thus hard to navigate. Additionally, wearing masks resulted in the obscuring of half the face, which we came to realize we had relied upon to build rapport in all of our earlier ethnographic pursuits, with smiles and small facial gestures throughout interviews and other casual conversation. We found that what allowed us to build up the rapport that we had lost with social distance and masks was our photographic method. So to speak briefly then about the visual element of the project and about our use of the camera in the field. We were cognizant that the camera was a methodological tool, but also served as a representation of power, in that it was a physical manifestation of the presence of the researcher in a relatively private space of fieldwork. That said, the camera, when used appropriately and with attention to this power, can also serve as a way to establish deeper connections and collaborative techniques with those whom we interviewed. During each interview, where we also photographed the women, we showed them their posed images. We placed the camera with the images displayed on a nearby surface, and the women then reviewed those photos. In this way, we offered a chance to share their assessment of our ethnographic eye. This allowed for a sense of rapport building between us, and it also created a sort of co-constitutive process of image making in the field. Beyond this type of participatory methodology, we found that the camera was useful for theorizing the space. And we want to note here just briefly that the visual is a useful theoretical tool in regards to waiting. Waiting is embodied. It is lived through the body and it is active in process. The visual method, therefore, captures the active agent in a more profound way than just words could have. So with that, let us move now to thinking through waiting and its embodied effects as we see it in the following images and ideas. So the Lux, we're going to talk about just briefly as a space. It's classified as a boutique hotel, and that includes decor that we might be able to conjure in our minds together. Think delicate neon signage, concrete floors, mixed patterned wallpaper, and high-priced cocktails in the lounge. When COVID hit, the Lux emptied out, and the hotel owner agreed to partition one floor as a temporary shelter while the rest of the hotel sat empty. The local nonprofit, who before this had never run an overnight shelter, only just a day use and resource facility prior, worked rapidly to improvise a hotel cum shelter at the Lux. Depending on the fluctuating numbers of individuals needing shelter, the women were either placed in rooms alone or shared it with a roommate. The majority had rooms to themselves. These rooms were sparse in the modern design, but equipped with high-class, quote-unquote, amenities. Wi-Fi enabled flat screen TVs, birchwood furniture, memory foam beds, and opulently tiled bathrooms. A long and narrow, dimly lit hallway connected the rooms. There was only one common space where you waited for the elevators, and the women and nonprofit staff made this into as communal as an area as they could with the limited resources the hotel provided them. There were donated board and card games, books, and magazines. Chairs lined the wall and a small table was set up next to the only window on the floor, which looked out over Main Street. Most of the women stayed inside throughout the day, either in their rooms or in the small communal area. There were frequent smoke breaks downstairs, always escorted by staff, as well as daily visits to the park across the street and trips to the stores nearby where women could buy food or snacks. The justification for the staff escort anytime they left the floor was for their health. If guests came into the hotel or visited them while at the park, there was risk of COVID transmission and a breaking of the shelter-in-place mandate that kept the shelter in operation. In this sense, it is important to recognize that the logic of quarantine is also the prevailing logic of shelter, that of bureaucratic restriction, regulation, and compliance. Understood through its limits, the Lux could be seen as another space of total confinement. Yet, within the structure of shelter in place, we also found a temporal space of improvisation in the waiting for things to come.
The practices we discovered during our research at the Lux led us to develop a new conceptualization of waiting that we call improvisational waiting. At first glance, the two words may not seem immediately relatable. Improvisation is an activity, whereas waiting is often considered a passive experience. Yet, whether we think of waiting as passive or not, all waiting is a particular engagement in and with time. The question thus becomes, under what circumstances and configurations of power do people wait? And how do people wait given such conditions? Sheltered at the Lux, the women and staff we came to know waited actively and demonstrated that improvisation and waiting could be combined into a single concept. Waiting here meant a set of creative practices, of improvisations, that transformed the empty time of shelter in place into new rhythms and future possibilities. While at the Lux, all of the women we met were waiting. They waited, however, in ways that generated experiences and visions that exceeded the structures and agendas of the shelter. Some women took the opportunity to be in close quarters with the nonprofit staff to advocate for themselves, to hustle in the effort to secure permanent housing. Other women took the opportunity to get clean from drugs, one woman for the first time in decades. Other women used the space of waiting for smaller but equally important acts, like learning Zumba, meditation, or yoga. One nonprofit staff member exemplified the act of improvisational waiting. When she offered yoga classes to the women at a city park across the street from the Lux, she did much more than break up the monotony of daily life under shelter. Using her past experience as a dance and yoga instructor, she improvised. Independent of organized activities or bureaucratic management plans, she created a new form of waiting that transcended the structures of shelter and afforded women new bodily practices of self-care and pleasure. Moreover, through the routine experience of yoga, the staff and the women formed new connections to each other and to place. It wasn't long ago that some of the women at the Lux knew the park in this photo as one of the many spaces to sleep in Memphis. Now, however, through the practice of yoga, the park could be experienced differently. It became the site for an active form of waiting that turned it into a space of bodily care. One of the insights we gained from our time at the Lux had to do with the different ways the women and staff use their experiences to transform the context and meaning of shelter. Although everyone at the Lux was subject to various regulations that governed most details of everyday life, the unique background experiences of the women and staff brought perspectives and approaches to the shelter that revealed a dynamic intersection of interests and intimacies that resulted in improvisation. Malcolm, for example, worked for the nonprofit at the Lux. He told us he came to this job after his own struggles with addiction and homelessness. With an intimate experiential understanding of these challenges, he framed his labor as more than the provision of services. For him, it was an extension of what he learned from his own experience rebuilding his life. Malcolm thus brought a story to his work, and that story shaped the way he envisioned himself and his labor at the shelter. He was not a mere instrument of the state or the total institution of a homeless shelter. He was rather an individual with an intimate view of the predicament some of the women faced. And more importantly, he was an agent, acting on his own ethical commitments to helping anyone ready to take the next step in their struggle.
The stark difference between the Lux and life on the streets offers much more than a captivating mental image. It provides us with a way to conceptualize the relationship between material conditions and the agential dynamic of imagination. As we noted earlier in the presentation, sheltering at the Lux does not erase the structural violence of houselessness, of living in a hyper-segregated city, or of structural racism and classism. Nor was Lux in some way outside of these structures. Instead, what we found was that through the acts of improvisational waiting, and for some of the women through the safety and comforts of their accommodations, there was a provocation of new ways of being and new imagined futures. The daily improvisational acts, relationships, and connection to place offered tangible evidence of a different form of life and the possibility of achieving it through the new practices repeated and honed while in shelter. As such, we found ourselves centering the notion of agency and self-making in the process of conceptualizing improvisational waiting.
The transformation of empty time into improvised waiting was visible in distinct ways among the women at the Lux. For Carol, this transformation involved the rediscovery of an early passion in her life, singing. During the long days at the shelter, Carol would sit with her phone, singing songs of her own that expressed hope and a future horizon beyond her previous experiences. These songs were more than a pastime. They were the source of strength and resolve. More importantly, they were an improvised form of waiting that helped provide a sense of possibility of something better for her future. As Carol told us, "Oh, I'm excited because it's been a long time coming. I'm looking forward to the future, and I feel like the best is yet to come for me." As a shelter, the Lux was an intersection of distinct trajectories. Most of the women were strangers to one another, and they understood that their encounters while sheltering were only part of a temporary experience. For two women we met, however, the Lux was one stop on a shared path. These women met on the streets of Memphis, and their relationship was formed in part through the common vulnerabilities they faced as women surviving homelessness. Before the Lux, they watched out for one another and developed a bond through the struggle of living without permanent shelter. At the Lux, this bond took on new dimensions. With the prospect of a new living situation, they plotted a future that extended the connection they forged while homeless. In this future, however, these two women, who called each other sisters, imagined a more positive, less vulnerable existence. Anticipating a new context for an old bond, these women reworked their friendship in ways that demonstrated the profound link between waiting and agency. Waiting here involved the improvisation of a friendship that reflected a mutual desire for a new connection, forged under less precarious circumstances than it began.
We present to you today in a very different landscape than in the early spring of 2020. The horizon of COVID-19 seems to be shifting, or at least our relationship to waiting feels different than it did in those early weeks. Our project was much shorter than the other research that we've conducted previously, and the Lux shelter itself no longer exists. The third floor is once again taken up by tourists slowly trickling back into the city. The more time we spent at the Lux, the more we saw the project as inherently future-oriented. That is, because of its temporariness, the women at the Lux did not simply wait for things to happen. Instead, living at the Lux was a waiting while. There was waiting while many made plans, made new friendships, and experimented with new future-focused modes of being. As such, we came to see the power in theorizing waiting as agential, action-oriented, and embodied. We argue that centering the action in waiting is also a centering of dignity for those who find themselves entangled in precarious spaces and bureaucratic institutions. The Lux represents a unique phenomenon in which those structures were not yet laid down in stone, and through improvisation and with the heightened meaning of waiting as the whole world sheltered in place, we found that a strong sense of agency emerged. Like the Lux itself, our project was a temporary event. It was designed to capture a moment in the lives of a particular group of women living like the rest of us with the effects of a global pandemic. For the women we worked with, however, this was not simply a story about the pandemic. For them, the Lux was part of a much larger encounter with the realities of houselessness. And whether they are now living their better lives they envisioned at the Lux, these women are, in all likelihood, continuing to confront the structures, racial, gendered, economic, bureaucratic, and so on, that make homelessness more than a terminal event. The encounter with homelessness, in other words, should not be defined by a binary of shelter and street, but instead by the ways individuals act with agency and dignity within and against the structures that surround them. For this reason, there's more work to be done. More can be understood about the relationship between waiting and agency from the project we began at the Lux, and we offer our presentation today as an opportunity to continue doing this work. Far too often, anthropological research is taken as a sort of property that remains in the hands of those who began a project, and we argue it shouldn't be. Anthropological understanding is no one's property, and we encourage you all to consider the situation confronted by the women at the Lux, like all participants in the work of anthropologists, as a beginning, not an end. And so in conclusion, we urge you to all understand, to advocate, and to challenge the structures and power that impinge on the lives of those who we are fortunate enough to learn from. Thank you. And that concludes this part.
Fantastic. And if you stop sharing your screen for us, that would be fantastic, fabulous. And yes, Crystal, many claps. I am going to very quickly ask one of our fellows to start off with the first question, and then I'm hoping our faculty members and others will sort of move right in. And I'm going to gallery view, so that's what's being broadcast now. All of you, please feel free to turn on your cameras. I would ask that you just you keep yourself muted until you're talking, so that we don't get too much background noise. But let's make it a gallery now, a real gallery. If you can, please turn on. I understand maybe you can't. You're not in a situation you can't, and that's okay too. But if you can turn on your camera, please feel free to turn on your camera.
Everyone.
Yes, hello. So who wants to start us off from our fellows with a question for our speakers on this fabulous talk? Karen, you look like you're ready to go.
Yeah, I can ask. I was going to ask, what were your experiences like being with the women right there? Like, how did your relationships, did you guys have interactions with them? How did that kind of affect your entire study? And what were those relationships like personally, I guess?
You want to get this one, Michael? Do you want me to?
Yeah, well, that's a sort of long question in the sense that, for one thing, the very work I was doing, or we were doing, but I say me because I was a guy in a space of women encountering homelessness, and so there was a little bit of adjusting for me to really think about myself being in that space and what it meant to be able to try to talk to women, who for many of whom relationships with men may have been complicated. So there was a sense in which coming to know these women, there was a little bit of, I wouldn't say anxiety, but a little bit of reservation on my part. And I think Lindsay would be a little bit more able to kind of approach the women in a way that at first I wasn't sort of really ready to do immediately. So I had to be kind of aware of the ways that maybe I should allow for space between people. That being said, eventually, I think we really kind of, the people we talked to grew comfortable, it seemed to me anyways, to talking to us. And there were several people for whom it didn't seem like that issue really mattered. Now, I will say one other thing about this. There were plenty of the people at the hotel that we did not meet and we did not interact with. And there were plenty of people who didn't want to, and others who, just kind of conveyed in a sense that they were doing their own thing. And so we're giving you a kind of insight into those who decided, in a sense, that they were willing to engage with us and sort of establish some kind of relationship while we were there. But there were plenty of people who didn't. So, we're fortunate and we're really thankful for the kind of honesty or trust that we gained with the folks we worked with. But we also want to recognize that there were plenty of people who just felt, I think, better off not engaging at all.
Yeah, and I would add to that, just really briefly, it was really interesting because doors were able to be closed to us, both literally and metaphorically. And going back to the earlier part of our presentation when we talked a bit about positionality and about power, right? And kind of our role and being self-reflexive in the field. Michael just described his kind of process of self-reflexivity, a gendered self-reflexivity, right, in the field. For some of these women, the ability to close the door literally on our faces, right? Like when we walked by and asked if we wanted an interview, I think, again, kind of, there's a sense of a power differential being met and being leveled there, right? That I think was important to note and was important for us, obviously, to respect, right? But also to think about, as typically shelters don't have individual rooms, right? And so that was just a really interesting kind of element of who decided to be part of the project or not.
Sorry, I'll say one more thing on that, because I think the door part is quite important. You know, I mean, and think about
the door, Michael. What were we?
Well, you know, like think about the space itself. If you've been in hotels, like it's a long hallway with the little square area in front of the elevator. So like physically, you couldn't be in this space without feeling like you were kind of imposing or creating yourself. Your body in the space was in effect kind of always, it was hard to not be in the way or not feel like you might be in the way. So, you know, the door becomes like that threshold in a certain way. And and so it was a fairly, you know, I've worked in a very crowded, you know, refugee camp, but it's still not the same thing. So it was a kind of unique in way to sort of come to relate to people and to talk to people and to feel the sense that people don't want to talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a couple questions coming in from Facebook. I'll get to these in just a minute. I want people to know that we are going to respond to those, but let's get a couple more from our group in here. Do our faculty want to, yeah?
Well, first, I just have to praise this incredible, compelling project that I think has offered such an important, unique, and valuable experience for all of us who are getting to learn from you. One of the reflections that I had from your presentation was the beautiful recognition of the connection between agency and waiting. And, you know, often when we see stories of homelessness, we see stories of men, we see stories of family, but it's much less frequent, at least in my mind, to see stories of women alone and homeless. And when I think about the agency and waiting relationship, that seems like a uniquely women's experience. I mean, there's all of these narratives of women who are waiting for things and suddenly then they will find their agency. And I really appreciate the way that you have restored the power in the act of waiting. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little, and particularly the experience of the women waiting as a gendered kind of experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great point, and thank you for making it. I think, Michael, I'm definitely jump off what I'm going to say. I think, you know, when we think about kind of the intersecting structures of passivity, right, and how something like passivity is constructed in the media, even in scholarly narratives of these kind of institutional spaces, for lack of a better word. I study the prison, right? So that's certainly an institution, right? So you're absolutely right. Something like passivity is gendered. I think it's also racial, right? So when you have to think about yourself constructing a narrative of what waiting is and who is waiting and how waiting is embodied and kind of lived, you absolutely do have to kind of think about those broader narratives and those broader social structures that you are yourself perpetuating when you write it down or take a photo or what have you. So I appreciate you saying that, and I agree. You know, the concept of agency takes on hyper importance, I would say, right? Agency, dignity, these types of ideas. Especially when you add in the intersectional structural elements of the self, right? Gender, race, class.
Yeah, and I guess I'd add, well, you know, one of the other overarching, which this very much linked up with my own sense of work, is the very representation of people encountering homelessness as in need, as peer victims, you know, insufficient and incapable in certain ways, and so. in addition to the layer of the gendered layer you pointed to, I think it was really important to kind of overcome the burdens of those representations. And even with the sense of, my own work with Palestinian refugees is that things like endurance are also forms of agency, right? I mean, to endure while waiting takes a lot out of people, and the modes through which people understand and experience endurance is important. And things like the things that I learned from some of these people and what it took for them to endure whatever circumstances they were confronting. That's a dignifying, compelling sort of sense of agency as well. Instead of seeing, in other words, the encounter with the challenges of homelessness as the production of a victim, which I'm not discounting victimhood either, but I say it's not the only thing, right? And I think that, well, at least we hoped, I believe that that the work we did kind of brought that to the center as well.
This is really interesting because we had a couple questions from Facebook that I think really intersect with this because we're getting a nice viewership outside here. And we had two questions that I'll kind of combined. Johnny Jackson asked that it looks like most of these women were Black women or women of color, and asked how could you speak to how these women of color benefited from your research? And as kind of a follow-up to this, because I think they're related, to what degree, and this is from Dewey Balboa, to what degree was the waiting itself a causal factor in changes in these participants' lives, as opposed to what may have been more stable, safer physical and social environment during this period?
Two good questions. Great question. I saw Michael writing it down, and I was thinking really hard while you were talking, and I didn't write it down, and now I regret.
No, I couldn't get the second part, so I got the benefited part, but then there was waiting and causal, and I just wanted to make sure I got that question because it's kind of a long, strong question.
Yeah, so it's almost a follow-up, but it's Dewey Balboa was asking, to what degree was the waiting itself a causal factor in changes in these participants' lives, as opposed to what they may have been would have been a more stable, safer physical and social environment during this period? And I think you've talked about some of that, but maybe to reemphasize that, I think the whole last end of your talk really sort of addresses some of that.
Yeah, I guess I would say, to address the first question, which I think is a really important one, the word benefit, it's interesting. Michael and I were having a conversation about as we constructed the PowerPoint together, we were thinking about reflecting back on writing the IRB, right? Which seems like the most dry, speaking of dry bureaucratic things to do when doing research. But you fill out a little section on the IRB that talks about the difference between risk and benefit, right, of the folks who you're working with. And in this really precarious research context during a pandemic where we didn't know what would happen next, right? I think that was a very kind of unique experience for us. These ideas of risk, these ideas of benefit all became kind of almost analytic points for us, in addition to ethical and kind of moral questions for us as well. I resist personally thinking about the idea of benefit as in my presence benefits, right, a particular group of people whom I'm working with. I tend, as an engaged scholar, to kind of reverse that thought, right, and think how is something mutually beneficial, right, or how can I be of service, right, as an engaged scholar and an applied scholar. So I would say, there's that element, but there's also just an element, I think, of being present to capture a story, right? And to capture a person's life history and life experience that is powerful, right? And Michael and I had our set of questions, but we kind of did do a free-flowing, almost life history narrative type of interview, or made room for that, right? When questions emerged. That I think, when we think about what's beneficial in the moment, kind of an intimate beneficialness, right? Kind of just interpersonal. I would speak to that. And I'm curious, Michael, if you'd have anything to add. And then I have an answer for the second part too, but like you said, we also covered it a little bit in the talk.
Yes.
Yeah, so benefits is always, it's a challenging question to think about. I mean, one practical. That's what we're looking for, right? If there are different ways that people can ask or conceptualize what gain do people get out of the work that we do, and it's a very valid question. Well, one thing I hope is that, like we mentioned in the presentation, the idea of the approach to, quote, solving the problem of homelessness is the difference between shelter and non-shelter. Well, I would hope that to some extent, this directs the attention of those who are thinking about this beyond that simple dichotomy, and to make sense of the ways that people themselves envision not just shelter, but shelter as part of a larger constellation of possibilities that they would like to realize for themselves, or trying to make sense of as they sort of take steps towards living towards another form of living outside of living in the encounter of homelessness. So that's what I would say. I mean, it's always hard. I mean, I've worked with my own work with Palestinian refugees. Sometimes it's, I'm not a consultant, and I can't say, oh, well, I've got a policy suggestion that's going to change everything for those folks. No, they're still stateless. They're still stuck in those situations, and they're still doing other inventive things to sort of transform the conditions they've been given. But I would hope, so it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to give you like the perfect answer of how exactly someone's going to practically benefit from this. But I would hope, and remember, this was, commissioned by this nonprofit. And we're still connected to this organization through the department, et cetera. So, that one hope is that it, in fact, informs the ways they think about what shelter means for people.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank you for saying that, Michael. That was really well said. And I wanted to just add to that, Michael and I both study identity, right? And we take that word seriously, and we take it as something that actually can affect change, I think, on the ground. I study identity in relationship to incarcerated people. And like Michael was saying, if you include kind of these qualitative narratives, these life narratives, these experiential narratives of individuals within this space into other kind of material considerations of what shelter could look like, material needs, economic needs, which are all critically important. But the ways people conceptualize themselves, the ways people conceptualize their futures and future wants and needs and hopes, I think if that's taken seriously in policy, right, in these kind of broader discourses in government and in the nonprofit sphere, that can only help.
Awesome. So we're getting like a wonderful compression of people in line here. I know I think Carol and Sage have some questions to ask, but I was going to wonder if Amanda Masterpaul, since these outcomes through art seem to be connected, do you want to say something there before I move to Carol and Sage's questions, and then back to Wendy?
Absolutely. So again, Lindsay and Michael, just thank you so much for the opportunity to share this work out with all of us. To follow up on what you were just talking about and sharing, so I work with performance and I work with applied theater, and I've worked with young adults and youth who are experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity, and using performance as a modality for materializing their dreams, their hopes, their aspirations, and to see that actually become materialized and real and tangible through an artistic medium like that, and deeming it as a liberatory act. But I'm always curious, that when we go into work with community, to work alongside community, in solidarity with community, what is the longstanding impact? And so I am curious that with the research that you conducted in this study, is there any opportunity to continue to engage with this nonprofit, or to see the potentiality for continued efforts that might have other forms of impact? Michael, you referred to more than just shelter or non-shelter, but the whole lived experience of community. But what the time just allowed us such an opportunity to reimagine future in so many ways and so many prospects. And so I'm very curious to see about a continued impact with this organization itself as well.
Thank you. And your work is so important. I like the word liberatory that you use. That's really key in my opinion. Michael, I'm sure you'll jump in, but I did want to say that we were able to send interview transcripts, which was written into the consent process, to the nonprofit staff, which they were able to use due to their experience running the Luck shelter in this kind of ad hoc, really, chaotic time. They actually were able to create a permanent shelter that they're currently constructing, and they're currently setting up with much of the same staff that was at the Lux. So really, really interesting potential there for either Michael and I or other researchers that we hinted towards at the end of our presentation, to take up what we recognize as a very bracketed project, right? It was very much a moment in time project, but to expand that then and see what improvisation looks like in the long term, and to see how those things, when actually written in stone in a permanent shelter, right? How they transform or how they continue those practices. And we hoped that the interviews that we provided with specific questions about how their experiences were going with staff, with the nonprofit itself, we hope that those influenced it to some degree, right, the directorship of the nonprofit as they built this permanent shelter. That was our hope.
Yeah, I mean, so they actually, I attended one of the meetings for their planning of the space that they're reconstructing, this organization, and they're clearly taking certain things seriously, and beyond just, what we're contributing, of course, like the way they're imagining the very space of the center is actually, it tells me that they're thinking in terms that are quite broad and that actually go beyond the kind of typical ways that these things are thought of. I don't know, it's an interesting idea of what that space provides for people who are, because one way to think about it is they're even considering how that space functions for people that aren't quite, quote, sheltered yet, but who are interacting with the organization. Another thing I would say is that we're an applied program. One of our current grad students wants to work with this nonprofit, and it's part of a long, I think, hopefully, long continuing relationship. And I mean, that's part of the reason why they reached out to us in the first place. So we hope that there's a kind of ongoing mutual relationship and opportunities for us to interact and provide things. What I was thinking in relation to what you said is performance is like a modality, and that's what we're talking about, like actions and activities that we consider improvised that function as a kind of modality towards a possibility of a future. And performance as a liberatory act. I mean, it's interesting because I imagine in the space of theater, one performs and constitutes the sort of spatial reality as well, and produces, like, through props and things, this kind of material visualization of something as well. Where in this case, people were having to, in some ways they were relating to the materials context in ways. We talk a little bit in the article about what it meant to have a flat screen TV and like these opulent things that the hotel provides. But how different meanings assigned to these things are constructed in relation to these things provided a kind of prop, so to speak, for not thinking that, we're going to, what people weren't telling us, I can't wait to have flat screen TVs and a king size bed. That's not what they were. That's not what they're thinking about, but nonetheless, those things provoked a kind of way of relating and thinking about a future in certain ways. So, and in that regard, facilitates a kind of, not quite a performative, but a performance, but a kind of modality of engaging time and space that leads to, that I think, well, at least was thought of as leading to something. So your work is really compelling in the sense that even the very language it provides for thinking about some of this stuff.
Awesome. It's what these conversations, I think, lead to. Carol and Sage, do either of you want to jump on in here?
I can hop on in. Hi, I'm Carol. I'm a graphic design major at Coastal. So a lot of the questions I had were basically answered, like imagining where the next step would be for like the ideas of what a shelter could be. So I wanted to jump to like, were you thinking of, or would it be possible to have any follow-ups with any of the women that you did interview and spend time with, just to see like where their imagined futures did take them, or is that not possible?
good question. I think it's possible. I think, there's the reality of, again, a pandemic fieldwork moment is still something that at least I think Michael and I are both unpacking in terms of how then we continue to make connections, how we connect through the nonprofit staff. We don't want to be an imposition to the nonprofit staff as they're doing this to be like, hey, can you track down, so, I think that it's possible. And again, it's something that we, the Memphis model, as it were, of engaged anthropology is for it to be this kind of intergenerational approach. So if a graduate student, for example, would want to take this up as their MA practicum research, or an undergraduate wants to write a BA thesis on these topics, that is something that we're really going to strongly encourage as well, just for our own. We're hoping that both of our individual projects open up to us again sometime in ever, hopefully. So, if that's the case, then I'm not sure, but I think I can speak for Michael and say that we're both absolutely, it's a possibility.
Yeah, I would only add that one of the things is because of the context in which this project happened, there was a kind of a finiteness to it, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The parameters were quite different. If Lindsay and I are to do that, which is we're thinking about, we'd have to turn it into a long project, because it wouldn't be right to do it any other way, and it would require a large commitment that, I'm not saying we're not interested in doing, but it's something that's quite different from the context in which the project itself emerged. But like Lindsay said, with students interested in working partnering with these organizations that we have ongoing relationships with, especially if we're the supervisors or the students are on their committee, we interact again. And so it's possible to do it in another form, actually, by way of our graduate students as well. So certainly something to think about, but the parameters were quite different. So it does present, it's a different sort of thing to do it.
Mm-hmm. This is amazing. I have so many things that, but I have to stay out of this because there's just so much to. I think we'll go Sage and then Wendy. I think because we've got time to get in. So Sage, I think you brought up a kind of big structural question. Do you want to pose that?
Well, I love a big structural question.
Which one? My first question or my second question?
I think about capitalism. You want to go capitalism?
Oh, yes.
Capitalism.
Bring it.
So I didn't really form I'm Sage, by the way. I'm an English major with a women gender studies minor. And I've been thinking a lot recently. One of my professors, shout out Dr. Smith, we were talking about how capitalism shapes our imaginations and like how we can't really imagine our futures without capitalism, even if we're socialists or whatever it is, because that's all we have known. So I'm just wondering, like, what are your thoughts on, because we're talking about these women's like imagined futures, and it's like, how does their situations and like capitalism and oppression have to do with their imagined futures?
That is a big question. We're gonna go there, and I love it. I love that we're gonna go there. You want to go, Michael?
Well, yeah, I'll offer some really quick short reaction. One thing I would say is that while that's true, capitalism has experienced itself in different forms, and so we could expect different iterations of the quote capitalist dream, right? In other words, while they're certainly formed under these conditions of capitalism, they're certainly not the same. And even if they resemble one another, there may be different forms of appropriating capitalism to different ends. So, but one of the reasons I say that is because when I think back about some of what was not included, for say in the article, and I think back about what some of the women told us of their experiences, even in childhood, it would be there's a definite sense of consideration I'd want to give the relationship between economic aspirations and the conditions from which people's lives come from, so that I don't reduce that experience to a mere iteration of a capitalist total system, while acknowledging that system's an issue. So, and I struggle with this too, because a lot of people, there's this sense in which like people will say to me, and dealing with, when talking about refugees I work with, are they just, are these neoliberal visions of self-improvement, and while that has, while there's certainly a dimension of truth to that, there's also a dimension to which with that almost functions as a cliche that erases so much about what people bring to their own lives and how they understand and develop the next steps. But capitalism is certainly an issue, right? Because there's it's a big structural context through which not only does the nonprofit function, but then these people's lives function as they kind of work toward developing whatever possibilities of a life they can establish, which includes probably labor, some form of labor, and other things. So I don't have a definitive answer, but I'd just add those nuances to the question, I suppose is how I'd put it.
and I would just jump in and say, I agree with what Michael said. And I think the question that you asked is a good one, but it's very easy then to become very cynical, I think, and think to oneself, why even have the imagination element if it's just capturing some mode of capitalism. And I think I theorized this, and this was a massive struggle when I started to theorize identity and selfhood and dignity within the prison space, which is also considered kind of a totalizing space, right? And a space where you become a prisoner, for lack of a better term, just like you live under capitalism and cannot escape from it, right? And so how do individuals kind of creatively maneuver within that institution and within a particular kind of space in order to kind of create oneself, not escaping that institution fully, but living creatively, acting agentially, to make meaning in one's own life, right? And so I always think about it as creative living under these structures or within these structures, which in the process of doing so allows the structures to be reformed or hopefully abolished. But that's a conversation for a different time.
It's awesome, and I'm going to hand it over to Wendy as we move closer to the hour. I just want to say that there's a side conversation going on. Johnny Jackson came back and said when Dr. Feldman kept saying "in the wait," I kept thinking of Christina Sharp's work on "in the wake." Yes. Like, how does being Black and women and being in waiting create futures and destinations not known to American empire? And I think this connects with that. And then Sarah Loyola got in here with Fred Moten's riff on "In the Break" in terms of using music. So there's a wonderful little riff on Facebook going on. And Wendy, you had another question. And I just want to say, if we don't get everybody in here, there'll be afterlives to this. So we'll do as much as we can within the time that we have. Wendy.
I'm really interested as a qualitative and critical researcher in this dichotomy that you presented to us in really rich ways about surveillance and surveillance in part through the work that you did with a community partner. And I'm interested in how the people who worked in the homeless shelter and organized with the Lux responded to your work, because to recognize appropriately as you did the ways that this nonprofit community partnership that's interested in working with and helping people in shelter does ultimately exercise an amount of control and surveillance over them, responds to you as researchers potentially coming in doing work in advocacy with a camera, which is typically recognized as an act of surveillance. And it's like, how did the homeless shelter itself, the organization, respond to your work?
Great question.
It is.
While I'm thinking, I want to just plug that "In the Wake" book again, because I just read it and it's life-changing for me. I'm a visual ethnographer, and so this is and again in the spaces that I typically do visual ethnography, absolutely surveillance is kind of the name of the game, right? And it is something that it's again a continual kind of self-reflexive need, right? To think sometimes you just put the camera down and or don't bring it in, right? Depending. But as far as the staff goes, it's really, I think we can't impress enough how novel, to use the pun, the shelter was in the pandemic. Everyone was trying to just figure things out day by day, sometimes hour by hour. And so our presence there, I think, and Michael, I don't know, this is just me kind of reflecting personally. I think it kind of was just like one more thing, really. And they were all very receptive and very open. And they just kind of incorporated us into, 2 weeks into this, we were just kind of there. And so we just were there, and we made sure we were continually checking in with every staff member to say, when can we step in here? Should we step in here? We started only outside first on the smoke breaks. We didn't go inside. So we kind of eased ourselves in. And for us too, kind of easing ourselves in, trying to figure out where we felt comfortable with COVID transmission, right? So it was gradual, and it was very much an act of continual communication with the staff, but they were incredibly supportive. And again, I think everyone was almost interested in seeing what would happen, right? There's that sense of kind of immediacy that I think was helpful for us, because we were there to document it to some degree or another.
Yeah, I thought people were quite cooperative, actually, and open. And as Lindsay was saying, this agency went from interacting with people often like on an appointment basis to being in the same space with them for their whole shift. Yes. With the same people, right? And that was a big transformation for them. But I never got the feeling that we were in the way, so to speak. And I think we were pretty open to assisting if there was anything that, they're modest things, but like helping set up the lunch hour or something like that, Yeah. And they provided us with a room to talk to people. So there was a degree of privacy. They provided that. And so it was, and I think also part of it was because, like one of the people I mentioned, Malcolm, they're such an interesting group. And this is, having worked with, I know the literature, and I'm familiar with and sort of respect the work that's been critical of people who are working on behalf of institutions that have control and surveillance, like humanitarian institutions, for example. On the other hand, these people are not just instruments, and they bring to these positions their own stories, their own creativities. And sometimes, they act like, what the institution asked them to act like, and at other times they don't. And so, that's one of the reasons why we brought the staff into the picture, was because they themselves, whereas Lindsay was saying, like, it was so ad hoc, people were kind of figuring things out. And the ways that they were doing it too, I thought brought life to the entire experience, or we thought brought life to the entire experience of the space. Mm-hmm.
Well, I hate to interrupt this because it just seems like it's gaining momentum, but we wanted to keep this within a reasonable time frame. And I want to close very briefly with some thanks, but also saying that, you made a comment earlier that this was a practice, a performative, an investigation of waiting while, not waiting for. And I think that one of the things that this new center, the Edwards Center for Inclusive Excellence, is trying to experiment with is exactly this notion of the whileness, of reappropriating it in creative pursuits. We're very excited about the future of this. I think that there's such potential. I may be a little bit idealistic, but I think there's potential not only for institutions to reimagine, you were just talking about, and reappropriate energy and new futurities around this, but to also think about the role of the public institution, the public regional institution, even, in having a really creative role in that. I want to thank our speakers because this has just been so fabulous. And I want to thank our students who've been involved in this. And I want to thank Dr. Wendy Weinhold and Professor Amanda Masterpaul for bringing in this interdisciplinary connection. My hope is that this is a spark toward a fire of future after conversations and after lives, because it's just been beautiful. I've had an email exchange just about some other kinds of things with Dr. Feldman earlier today, and who knows where we're going from here. So thank you all so much for joining us. Look for the launch of the center in the fall, because we have so much more of this coming. This will be available as a recording. There's been people on Facebook asking about this over and over again. And I've also saved the chat, which I'm going to try to do some interesting things with. And I think this format of having you speak in the gallery was a fun little minor experiment in playing with the modalities that we now have in the interim of COVID. Thank you all so much. I'm going to end the meeting now. if our two speakers would just stay on very quickly, and our students, we just want to say goodbye to you really quickly, properly. You can look for this recording at Facebook here in just a little bit as we close things off.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Lindsay and Michael, this was just really lovely. You were so compelling and so interesting, and